Good afternoon, everyone. Dear participants, I would like to warmly welcome all of you here during our first afternoon session named A New Era of EU-NATO Cooperation, Crisis Management in the Dawn of New Defense Challenges and Hybrid Threats. My name is Zdenek Roth, and I will be today's moderator of this panel. Furthermore, let me introduce our distinguished speakers who had accepted our invitation to come down to Munich. I would like to sincerely thank them once again for coming. Thank you. And our first speaker on my right is Barbora Maronková, NATO Program Officer and Advisor, working for the Public Diplomacy Division and Division. Welcome, Barbora. Our next speaker is Rear Admiral Jürgen L., Senior Military Advisor to the Managing Director for Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response, European External Action Service. Our third speaker, connected online, retired US Major General Gordon Skip Davis. Gordon Skip Davis is a Senior Fellow at Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at Center for European Policy. And our last distinguished speaker, James Black, Assistant Director, Defense and Security Research Group RAND, also affiliated with Cambridge University. I would like to welcome all of you here. Moreover, before we move on, at the end of our main part, I will take questions from the audience, so should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. As we are going to discuss soon, many things have changed in the EU-NATO cooperation since the EU-NATO declaration signed in Warsaw in 2016. However, before we dive into the strategic and important questions regarding the EU-NATO cooperation, I would like to begin with the questions of a lighter nature. Since all the happenings after the 24th February have impacted each of us differently, we are all here, are curious how the Russian invasion has impacted all of you here. Barbora, how was your day on the 24th February? Run us briefly through your day.
I should rather say run us briefly through the night before the 24th. And well, to be actually honest, we were in The Hague, in the Netherlands. I was working at that time with our NATO policy planning unit. We were preparing the new strategic concept for NATO. And part of our work were consultations with our allies. And we were planning a seminar in The Hague with the Dutch and the German ministries of foreign affairs to discuss how do we tackle partnerships in the new strategic concept. So from Brussels, but also from the capitals, we had people flying in, including from many of our partner countries, into The Hague, where we were going to discuss that. So after we gathered on 23rd, and we had a really great dinner, we went to bed, and then about at 4 in the morning, the phone started going crazy and ringing, and then pretty much everybody jumped into the cars and planes and trains or whatever we had, and run back to Brussels. So on top of that, we actually were supposed to have a special session on Ukraine. We had the Director General of Security Policy from the Ukrainian MFA who flew into The Hague on the 23rd. Okay. So that was quite an extraordinary day.
Thank you. What about you, Admiral?
Yeah,
how did you spend the 24th or the night before?
No, I have also to reflect on the night before because I had also a dinner at NATO headquarters with ambassadors, generals and admirals. And I remember it was very tense, but it was not clear. It was really not clear, to be very honest to you, what would happen the next day. Some say, okay, we have to be alerted, but it can also be, in German, we call it a Strohfeuer of Putin, so that he will threaten, but not in the last consequence do it. No? And then and then the other day we heard certainty what he did, and so I mean it was not a surprise, but also even the evening before it was not very clear if he would really do it or not. I remember that very well.
Okay, thank you, Admiral. What about you, Skip? How was your night? Or the day after?
I think I had a little more tranquil night than Barbara or Jürgen. I'm a non-resident fellow for SIPA. So I'm here in my house in Italy. In fact, I just left NATO a few months earlier and was kind of transitioning to post-career activities, I'll call it that. But that said, the months leading up to the invasion had led to a flurry of analysis, requests for engagement on my part within SIPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis headquarters at Washington, D.C. It had been the main focus of, is Ukraine prepared? Is Russia actually going to? Are all the various efforts ongoing by NATO and EU sufficient? And they were bringing in Ukrainian experts that could cover security, defense, economics, the political and social construct, et cetera, and also more Russian analysts. So, when I woke up on the morning of the 24th to the invasion, okay, then it was a full day of focus on the events. I had personally been in Odessa with my wife on my last kind of NATO mission there in July of the previous year. And so it was a personal event. And I'd been following Ukrainian events since October of 2013, when I'd been at the Allied Command Operations and in charge of intelligence and operations. So it was personal. We were focused on it. We've been speaking about, the potential for and how would Ukraine react, et cetera. So it was a day on, put that way.
Thank you, Skip. What about you, James?
Yeah, so RAND is a research organization that does kind of classified and unclassified work for NATO and then different national governments. And so the night before, I was actually reviewing a report that RAND had done for US European Command on Russian military doctrine and operational art. And I just remember thinking they're probably going to need to write a new chapter. And then the next day was slightly surreal because I was helping run a major kind of crisis management exercise with about 100 OF5, OF6s, so kind of senior military officials from across NATO. And there were also some non-NATO countries there, including a small number of Ukrainian armed forces officers. And to be clear, we weren't dealing with a kind of Russia-Ukraine scenario in the exercise, but it did suddenly feel that this is the sorts of things that we had been discussing and planning and preparing for were suddenly very real. And yeah, that was quite a profound day. Obviously, the Ukrainians had to quickly, go work out if they're heading home, if they're going to go fight, are they going to stay in the West and liaise. And then for the rest of us, we were watching, surrounded by all these kind of senior Russia experts and whatever, watching the news come in, watching the helicopters land, Hostomel, these sorts of things. And yeah, suddenly kind of, the sort of things we've been wargaming had turned into, not a game anymore.
Yeah. For me, it was also very personal because that time, during my time at the Czech MOD, I was also in Brussels, in NATO, actually. I remember on the 23rd, everybody discussing nothing's going to happen. And on the 24th morning, things have changed, and the chapters needed to be rewritten for the policy and doctrinal documents. Anyway, zooming in on the NATO, EU, and vice versa cooperation, Barbara, and you can look at it from the NATO perspective. What was basically fundamentally different in the cooperation between EU and NATO in the wake of the Russian invasion, from your perspective? What aspects of the cooperation were tested most, What was tested most between both of those institutions?
I mean, I'm a civilian staff member, but I also have here Skip, who was in a military uniform and civilian and NATO, so I leave maybe more technical military aspects to him and the real admiral. But what I can say from the position of the political side of the House, if I can start with that,
Sure.
is I think the most important thing is the sense of urgency. As you say, we might have been spending weeks and months in committee meetings and discussing if we write a third NATO-EU declaration, what will be in it and what kind of progress report we will do on what we have done together or not have done together. But I think Russia's aggression and unjustified invasion of Ukraine basically put all these things at the side of the table. Say, okay, now we have a major crisis on our own continent, on our own territory, testing us, testing EU, NATO, allies, democracy, everything that we have, and what are we going to do about it? And since you asked also what was happening on the 24th, among many, many other things, one thing that I found personally striking and amazing at the same time was that when the Secretary General called the North Atlantic Council for an extraordinary meeting that morning, the two people who were on the table with us at the time, with our allies, were the presidents of the Council and the Commission. So both Michel and Ursula von der Leyen were invited to this extraordinary summit meeting, and they held immediately a joint press conference with our Secretary General. And to me, this was a striking image of what we need to do and can do and shall do together as the two organizations. So I'm going to leave it at that for the moment, and then I can go into more details.
Thank you. Admiral, basically the same question for you, if you can look at it from the EAS perspective, what aspects of the cooperation were tested most?
I mean, you mentioned the EU-NATO declaration as of 2016.
Yeah.
We had one from 2018, the second one, and in last January, the third one. But what happened after the invasion was that was a real boost of EU-NATO cooperation. And it happened the same. There was a meeting of the heads of state and government of the European Union, and the NATO Secretary General was present, was invited. So there was immediately a very close cooperation, complementary between NATO and the EU. And this is one thing Putin has completely underestimated. This unity, first of all, the unity within the European Union, and I can tell later what measures we have now set up since this day of invasion to support massively Ukraine. He has completely underestimated this cooperation, this unity within the European Union, but also the relationship between the European Union and NATO. And also bilaterally, the relationship between the European Union and the United States as well. Then there was a great cooperation from the first day, and this cooperation is still going on. And we had just last week, we had a meeting of the EU defense ministers in Brussels, and there was also the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg was invited, and he discussed with the defense ministers of the European Union what can we do more for the Ukraine, where are fields of better and more intense cooperation between the European Union and NATO. So what I can say, what after the war happens, that NATO-EU relationship became more intense as it was ever before.
Thank you for providing us with your perspective, with the perspective from both institutions. Skip, given your military experience and your time at NATO, what did you feel was very well handled? What less well in the shared reaction of NATO and EU to the invasion? How do you assess that?
So let me take two things. One that was mentioned by Barbara and one was mentioned by Jürgen, which I think underline my response. First and foremost, I think the sense of urgency that Barbara talked about, the unity that resulted from the will to act or take decision together led to not just cohesion, but coherence and synergy in the actions of EU, NATO, as well as G7, OSCE, and other international organizations that were brought together by many of the same leaders in the transatlantic community or the European Union. So in terms of high marks, I would give, and I'll talk about NATO first, high marks in a number of areas, probably 4. In terms of the sense of urgency, there was internal intelligence sharing, a deep debate about what was about to happen, and then a consensus, and then actions taken. And the actions I would identify in terms of high marks in 4 areas. One is the increasing insurance for the allies that felt most threatened. Second, increased NATO military readiness, forward presence, operations and activities, all intended as a deterrent to Russia in terms of potential aggression against NATO allies. Third, I think holding a unified response in regard to Russia's unrealistic demands pre-invasion, and then of course post, the calling for withdrawal, etc. But calling for dialogue, diplomacy up front, communicating the consequences very clearly of Russian invasion to Russian leaders, I think was key. And then the fourth area was coordinating NATO's own actions with other IOs that I start off with, other international organizations, with the EU, with the G7, and then first and foremost, and also the CSC, OSCE. Those are high mark areas. Low mark areas, I think, with respect to the actual support to Ukraine. Lots of dialogue, lots of discussion, demonstration of unity in terms of the independence and right for choice of government, choice of foreign policy, defense policy, et cetera, on the part of Ukraine. But no real deep discussion on what are Ukraine's defense needs in the light of a potential invasion. What should we be queuing up for potential support? I think there was a general view that Ukraine would not last long in a very aggressive invasion, and so that may have led to less focus, as well as previous 9 years, almost 8 years of policy of not being directly involved in Ukraine, not wanting to be seen as a belligerent between Ukraine and Russia. All those I think led to less effort, focus on Ukraine, lethal assistance that I think could have been a focus, if not of NATO, at least a forum for allies to discuss. And if I could just add one quick thing, I know I'm going long here. In terms of the EU, I think that as mentioned by Jürgen, the fact that there was common messaging and on serious consequences, on internal intelligence sharing and debate and discussion was led to the unity we saw afterwards in terms of action by the EU in unprecedented ways.
Thank you, Skip. It was very, very important what you said, and we kind of already forgetting that after the invasion, the first 2 weeks, no one actually believed that Ukraine will be able to defend. And it surprised all the senior decision makers and security experts back in Brussels. And we should draw lessons learned before we begin underestimating some country in a war. But anyway, coming back to Rand, James, how do you basically assess the EU-NATO cooperation during the Russian invasion in Ukraine? Have you observed that in Rand, or did you discuss that? How those organizations reacted?
So, I mean, as you imagine, there's a lot of ongoing work for European and US governments at RAND trying to understand the emerging lessons from the conflict, both in terms of the kind of tactical and operational and military strategic lessons from the kind of Ukrainian and Russian combat operations, but also looking at that broader political response from the EU, NATO, and others. And I think there's really good points have already been made by the other panelists, so I won't regurgitate those. But certainly people were, clearly were surprised by the kind of speed, the urgency, the political unity, the fact that we were able to push through so many of these messages at that EU-NATO level, rather than it being falling down onto some of the kind of unilateral frameworks that had emerged over the last 10 years, really since Crimea, which effectively were created on the kind kind of basic premise that the larger groupings of the EU and NATO would be too slow to come to a kind of coherent political position, and that's why you have smaller groupings like, you know, the Joint Expeditionary Force, these sorts of kind of clusters, European Intervention Initiative, which are really, you know, intended to provide that kind of political substitute for slow collective decision-making EU-NATO. And we didn't actually have to use those. We were instead able to use the full benefit of EU and NATO and all of the institutional kind of heft that they bring. I think on the other positive side, what's been great to see is the kind of sensible, you know, close cooperation, but also the sensible delineation of responsibilities to where the EU and NATO have their asymmetric strengths. So, you know, NATO clearly has been at the forefront of establishing that enhanced Eastern flank deterrence posture, increasing readiness, all these sorts of issues we've talked about. You know, the EU has played a very important role in terms of mobilizing financial and humanitarian aid, looking at some of the economic and broader responses, disinformation, misinformation, these sorts of issues. But of course, I think we also need to remember that still a lot of the decision-making is still being driven at the kind of national government level. Obviously in coordination with allies and partners, but it's not all being done through these kind of larger intergovernmental frameworks. We're of course seeing that in terms of the provision of training and equipment to Ukraine, which is very much being driven, you know, at that national capital level. We're seeing it in terms of some of the declassification of intelligence that's been used to expose Russian kind of intentions, false flags, etc., which particularly US and UK governments have been doing kind of unilaterally and bilaterally. So we are seeing kind of this different, you know, there's a complex web of different institutions involved in Europe's security architecture, and what has been great to see is that the different kind of parts of that web are playing to their respective strengths, which I think probably, you know, avoids some of the fears of incoherence, duplication of effort, etc., that people had perhaps before the crisis.
Thank you. Well, this is what you said. It's extraordinarily important, kind of, as you mentioned, that both institutions should enhance readiness, and also should basically draw the spots where they could enhance the cooperation and maybe where not. And as we all know here, this is going to be extremely important for the future, kind of, to find those spots which needs to be strengthened and enhanced between both institutions, given the fact that both institutions work on different bases. However, even though still the CSCP, SSDP policy in the EU is driven by states as well, mostly sometimes by the same states that are sitting in NATO as well. But anyway, there has been also a lot of discussion about NATO's potential perspective on the EU's aspiration for a more autonomous security framework. I think this question has been here since the 90s. After when the Cold War finished, the EU started having its own aspiration to basically build up its own security and defense capabilities. Barbara, in NATO, how do you assess those, let's say, EU's attempts to have kind of autonomous security and defense system out of the NATO framework, let's say?
Sure. Well, I think I've been getting this question by all my NATO colleagues. We have been getting this question for years now, frankly speaking. And it gets a little bit tiring to continue responding it, in a sense that sometimes I think we forget the bigger picture. What I'm trying to say is that we have, at the moment, if I'm counting correctly, 22 NATO allies who are members of the European Union, probably 23 soon. I mean, I think this whole debate about EU strategic autonomy, NATO, is it good, is it bad, do you guys agree, are you happy with it? I think it's beside the point if you have 23 nations sitting in both organizations. And again, the Ukrainian the ongoing war in Ukraine has again, I think, showcased that the European security is very much and closely linked also with the transatlantic arm of NATO. Whether it's the North America providing support to Ukraine, or whether it's North America strengthening NATO's own defense and deterrence, which is to the advantage or to our own security here on the European continent. So I think both NATO and EU are two organizations that not only need to work together, they do work together, they are complementary, they can be mutually reinforcing, and that's what's happening as well now. You asked what was sort of the NATO-EU sort of reaction and immediate maybe testing of our organizational skills and capabilities in the aftermath on the 24th. But let's fast forward to today. I mean, we have done things together with the EU and NATO that a year and a half ago we wouldn't even dream of, talking about joint procurement, gathering defense industry representatives from both Europe and North America in our headquarters, inviting the EU Commissioner for Internal Market, not even Joseph Borrell, Internal Market Commissioner, and to be discussing it together in the framework of both NATO and the EU. We created NATO-EU task force on resilience of critical infrastructure. Again, this happened as an immediate reaction to the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. We were talking already, I think, in the first or second declaration, Real Admiral corrected me, that we are going to work together on resilience. We were struggling a little bit to define what exactly does that mean. As a result of Nord Stream, we are now sitting together and we are working together, NATO-EU teams, in identifying what are the gaps in resilience on space, information technology, energy, and transport. So I think the events have shown that if we have a major situation which concerns the security of the European continent, we need both organizations and they need to work together. And the more the EU inside is stronger, the better for us.
You said that they need to work together. Just a very quick question. Do you feel that they want to work together?
Who wants to work with him? Whom? Of course we...
Do you see it in practice?
But of course we see that. I just mentioned we set up the task force on the critical infrastructure. We see the flurry of attendance of NATO Secretary General to a lot of the EU high-level events, going to the European Parliament for the, I wouldn't call it hearings, it's more an American term, but Secretary General coming in front of the European Parliament, talking to the European parliamentarians, vice versa. So all of these are things that if one or the other side would not wish to do it, they wouldn't do it. Then we would not have the president of the Commission and Jens Stoltenberg flying in a helicopter somewhere in northern Norway, trying to find the biggest oil bridge, land bridge, and having a photo op together in those very sexy yellow jumpsuits that they were in.
Therefore, I'm asking, because this, before the Russian invasion, this was unclear. It was like they should work together, but some EU members, didn't really want to get to the table. This has changed. You just proved that.
I just proved that with examples.
Admiral, when we look at it from the European External Service perspective, what do you think is the future perspective between EU and NATO? And more importantly, for instance, did you have to cancel some, let's say, some projects going between the EU and NATO which didn't match the, after 24th landscape? Like there were some exercises like the EU IIR exercise in crisis management and so forth.
First of all, I'm very grateful that Barbara mentioned that 22 countries are members of both organizations, of NATO and the EU, and hopefully with Sweden we have the 23rd. So we must cooperate, because the member state within the member state, they don't have EU forces and NATO forces. We talk of a single set of forces. But I want to come back to what you said, strategic autonomy, because it's a very important point. In March, end of March 2022, we published, and it was written in the External Action Service, our strategic document, the Strategic Compass. And this is a very, very important document. It was adopted by all heads of state and government, by the European Union, and all EU foreign ministers and defense ministers. And if you read this document, it has 40 pages, and I encourage you all, you can find it online, Strategic Compass, you will find NATO mentioned in this EU document 23 times. And also, you will find it very clear that in the view of the European Union, NATO is responsible for the territorial or the collective defense of Europe, and not the European Union. I come back to strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy does not mean that the European Union wants to be responsible for the collective defense of Europe. This is NATO. This is Article 5. And you are right, this was discussed now for ages, this term, and we rather talk now today about strategic responsibility. Basically, that the European Union can decide in the sovereignty of the European Union where to engage in the world. And that, of course, must not be militarily. It can be, humanitarian aid, development aid, to build up the rule of law in certain countries. This is what you also said before. We have a completely different approach than NATO. NATO, of course, is a political alliance, but focused on military. And the European Union, we call it integrated approach, or it was in former times also called comprehensive approach. We have a whole portfolio of a lot of instruments, of civilian means, and security and defense is just one contributing part of it. That means that military, security and defense contribute to EU engagements in the world. And this is a big difference to NATO, and I just want to make the point that whenever you hear strategic autonomy from the European Union side, it does not mean that the European Union wants to be responsible for the collective defense of Europe. That is clearly the task of NATO.
Thank you. Then we are going to discuss a bit more on the strategic autonomy, since I would like to get some further opinions on that. However, now let's move to Skip. Skip, you as a retired Major General, basically the US has been shifting its focus since the Obama administration towards the Asian Pacific region. And there have also been questions around whether, let's say, the European allies, either within the EU or NATO, or in both organizations, can deter Russia without US presence. Let's say if US had shifted more of its military presence towards Asia, the Asian Pacific, do you think that Europe can deter itself from Russia? How do you see that?
So I may disappoint you by my response. Having been involved in both European theater force management when I was the Director of Operations, European Command, and then having a very inside view in global force management and review of all the defense plans of US across the world with allies and partners, I would tell you that I can't imagine the situation where US presence would go to zero. There are too many tasks that the US has committed to and would not want to necessarily release to ensure that European defense has the minimum, at least minimum, security support from the US. Let me just enumerate a few that will sound obvious to you. First off, the nuclear guarantee. For NATO to have a nuclear deterrent capability, the US has to participate. It's got to have its bases, it's got to have its munitions support groups, it's got to have at least a portion of the dual-capable aircraft that would deliver that to be a credible nuclear deterrent. It needs to have some tactical air support. It needs to have air refueling. That requires a significant amount of force. Now, that would be much less than U.S. Air Force Europe currently has in theater, but it's a significant amount. Then there's the need for ballistic missile defense. U.S. is committed to both the Aegis Ashore, which are U.S. forces that run those in Poland and Romania. There are a forward deployed naval force of Aegis cruisers. Currently, there are 4. Could that be reduced to 2, perhaps? But nonetheless, there would be a presence there to ensure missile defense from the Aegis afloat craft. And then there are reaction forces that the U.S. Army has, the U.S. Navy has, Special Forces, Africa, Special Forces, Europe, Marine Forces, et cetera, that are small in numbers, but still add up to thousands when you look across the theater, that are there, not just for NATO support, but for U.S. bilateral, multilateral action in the case of crisis in anywhere in the Middle East, in Africa writ large, in Europe, et cetera. So all those things add up to a good number of forces. And then there's the commitment to forward presence, NATO reaction forces that I doubt that the U.S. would ever decommit from unless there was a really serious dialogue about someone taking its place. And so for all those reasons, it won't go down to zero. Now, taking all that, let's say that the current 100,000, which was 80,000 before the conflict in Ukraine, goes down significantly. Would Europe be able to backfill? The simple answer is yes, but it still requires more effort on the part of allies in terms of readiness focus, defense investments and capability, ensure the right kinds of equipment, but also training and munitions. And those are all things that the allies are working on now, especially given the strategic concept that was decided in Madrid last year. There's a whole series of implementation actions as a result of the decisions made at Madrid and inside the strategic concept for deterrence by denial that require more commitment, more defense investment on the part of allies that would lead to exactly that kind of capability that I just mentioned.
Well, Skip, you seem pretty sure when you said if the presence went ground to zero that the Europe would be okay. What about when you look into the Libyan experience in 2011, when exactly Europe was missing the air refueling, intelligence, air support, and basically Europeans were not able to handle the situation in Libya without the Americans? Do you see since 2011 that it has moved forward, that let's say the equipment has...
Okay, that's a great question. Let me
has
correct the record.
Can you just briefly comment on that? Just briefly comment on that.
Sure. So, the experience of Libya, from the NATO point of view, and specifically the European allies within it, led to a number of efforts that completely, since 2011, there was a lack of joint ISR, and that has led to a huge number of initiatives, not the least of which is the NATO Alliance Ground Surveillance Force based out of Sigonella, and 5 active, Global Hawks from Northrop Grumman, the RQ-4 Deltas, that have maritime and airspace capabilities for, surveillance, mostly, special types of radars, and that have been employed pre-invasion and during the invasion to help provide real-time intelligence, at least near real-time intelligence, to allied civilian leaders and military leaders, as well as a whole bunch of other enabling policies and capability development initiatives that have increased the amount of joint ISR capabilities across the alliance available for collective defense or action. Second, transport, theater transport, and air refueling. There, have been a series of initiatives to improve air refueling capabilities, more platforms purchased by allies. Think specifically of the force in Eindhoven. 8 European allies have come together and have got a multinational transport and tanker fleet that is available for European Union, NATO, or national purposes for air refueling. So that is also taken place. And the last is munitions efforts. Maybe I should add the readiness efforts to vastly increase the number of forces ready for response to a crisis or a defense of NATO territory.
Yeah, thank you, Skip. James, you've been in the UK for so long. You studied there. You've been closely cooperating with the British government. how basically, what is the UK perspective on the, let's say, European attempts to get the strategic autonomy? This question is very relevant if we take into consideration that the UK has always basically held it always before any attempts to get strategic autonomy, basically served as a balancer between the US and France. What is the UK perspective now after Brexit, in the post-Brexit period?
Yeah, I'm always conscious. I'm often at these events somewhere in a European Union country, and I always have to kind of have that moment of, do I try and put on a non-British accent and kind of try and pretend that I'm not from Brexit Britain? Yeah, what's been really interesting, I think, has been seeing the debate evolve. So if you go back, 5-10 years, not just in Britain, but in a lot of countries, including America, but all across Europe, we started talking about European strategic autonomy. I think for a lot of people, that rightly or wrongly conjured kind of fairly utopian visions of an EU army, something that was going to duplicate NATO command and control structures, a level of ambition that was frankly kind of politically and technically unachievable. And of course, we do now have 22, hopefully soon 23 EU countries within NATO, but it's worth bearing in mind at the same time that the majority of defence spending, and indeed the majority of forces, is still from non-EU NATO members, because obviously you have America, you also have Canada, Britain, Turkey, Norway, etc. So clearly there is that indispensable transatlantic link, both in terms of the sheer kind of size, but also the quality of forces, the access to the intelligence, the ability to reinforce at scale and at pace across the Atlantic, and then all of those kind of strategic enablers where the US has invested so heavily. We've mentioned air-to-air refueling as one obvious example, but also space-based ISR and SATCOM and GPS and all these things. So there's always been an awareness in the UK that Europe needs to do more. And obviously, when we talk about European strategic economy in the UK, that includes all of Europe, so it would include the UK, not just EU strategic autonomy. But there's been awareness in Britain about any sort of effort that would undermine kind of NATO. And that's obviously not a view that is shared only by the UK. I mean, it was notable that when the UK left, there were a number of kind of Eastern European and Northern European countries in particular who actually had been able to kind of hide behind the UK veto on a lot of issues within things like European Defence Agency and EU, which obviously no longer they could do, and they would have to express their own kind of skepticism about some of these issues. Now, of course, what's really important to remember is things have moved on so much since then, and we mustn't focus on those kind of myths of what strategic autonomy means. I'm from a country that I have a lot of experience of seeing the impact of myths about the EU on a country. We have to remember now that we're in a different world, and both the EU and NATO are changing. So, on the NATO side, there is a lot of very rapid reform initiatives underway, political, technical, military. We're seeing a shift in kind of NATO's operating concepts, developing new warfighting concepts. We're seeing shifts in its planning to kind of a more integrated approach to deterrence and defense of the whole Euro-Atlantic area. We're seeing a kind of increasing focus on nations making more specialist contributions rather than everybody kind of trying to do a little bit of everything and duplicating as a result. We're seeing a lot of effort on emerging disruptive technologies. We've got Diana just been established, the innovation network, and then there's also in the strategic concept, which we have to again remember there's a huge gap between the 2010 and the 2022 strategic concept. The world had moved on, and the sort of strategic competition that NATO sees itself as involved in is very different in character. So it is a broader strategic competition with Russia and also now China that doesn't just focus on the military element, but also takes in all of those non-military aspects, where NATO is ultimately a political and military alliance, but it can't do some of the economic, some of the financial, some of the law enforcement, some of the humanitarian things that the EU can do. The strategic concept talks about AI, it talks about climate change, talks about China, talks about resilience. These are not issues that NATO can act on its own. And so these are the sorts of areas where I think the UK is now becoming more pragmatic about the need for cooperation with organizations such as the EU and other kind of frameworks in Europe. And I think it's the line that you brought up earlier. It's strategic responsibility, really, is the key thing. It's making a more credible, robust political, military, and economic contribution from Europe to that collective effort. And I think that's the key thing. The final thing I would say, though, is that again, the barrier to pushing this further is it's not necessarily at the kind of NATO EU level. It is ultimately still a lot of these issues are held back by decision making at the national level. If we look at, there are a lot of initiatives now through the EU and NATO to try and encourage more joint procurement between nations, to try and share military requirements and come up, we don't need to buy 19 types of helicopter, we could probably just buy one, that would be a nice idea. There's a lot of effort that's going on into those sorts of things. But ultimately, at the national level, there's always going to be those concerns around jobs, around employment, around sovereignty, around who controls the supply chains, around freedom of access, freedom of modification, these sorts of issues. So it's great that there's been a lot of progress at the EU and NATO level, and I think it's great that there is a more mature debate about European strategic responsibility. That is long overdue, but we need to kind of go further, I think, in our national political discussions.
If I may just add a short practical example of cooperation. We have in the European Union the defense initiative PESCO, which stands for Permanent Standing Cooperation, and we currently have 68 projects. Last week, the defense ministers, on the foreign ministers decided on 11 more, and they skipped 3. But what I want to say is that we have one flagship PESCO project. It is called military mobility, and we are very happy that 3 NATO countries joined this EU PESCO project, namely the United Kingdom, Norway, and the United States, and also Canada. So we are very happy that we have now starting also a cooperation between NATO and EU in the framework of this EU defense initiative. Just a little comment.
Definitely, for those of you who have not, came across the PESCO topics, I recommend you to review that. It's very interesting reading, as well as review the Diana project, as James has mentioned. It's going to have a very important impact for the future. Moving on, according to all of you, where do you see the biggest obstacles in reaching effective and functional EU-NATO cooperation regarding security, defense, or crisis management? Where do you see the biggest obstacle to reach some fruitful, effective cooperation? Barbara, I would like to begin with you.
I think with everything that we already mentioned and the different examples that my panelists have given, and looking at the past 18 months, my personal view is that most of the biggest obstacles so far, we managed to move on.
And which were those?
Like everything, it's about political will, it's about institutional cooperation, adaptation, it's about perhaps skipping some of the topics which perhaps were holding us back on grounds really which, they come more from bureaucracies than anything else. So what I would see is let's take advantage and gains from what we have achieved in the past 18 months and let's run with them maybe even faster than we did before. So let's not get distracted by something that will happen in 6 months or 8 months and the discussions, what if there is a change in leadership in one country or another. I'm not sure it's that helpful. Yes, of course, analysts need to think about these things, but I think the train has left the station. It's not a regional slow train, it's a TGV. Actually, I would say it's actually more than it. It's a Shinkansen, which is basically running, and we are on it, and we should continue going on it further and further. We see more and more coloration on issue of, for example, who would have thought that EU would actually be in lead and used EU money to procure ammunition for Ukraine, and then NATO coming in and coordinating, maybe advising in a certain way, listen, we have our own defense planning processes. We have capability targets for our nations. Let's make sure we are synced, that your ammunition helps also us in our defense planning, that it doesn't get changed or skirted over. These are extremely technical, but also very sensitive debates, which we are now having, literally as we speak. So I would prefer to be positive and to actually use what we have gained at the sacrifice of the Ukrainian people, sadly. But let's move ahead and go on.
Okay. Admiral, the same question for you. Where do you see the biggest obstacles from the EU perspective, EU institution perspective?
I mean, currently, I don't see any big obstacles. Of course, we have still the conflict, the political conflict between Cyprus on the EU side and Turkey on the NATO side. And this sometimes hampers institutional cooperation. But, think big. In the big picture, everything is so positive. And you elaborated already, while NATO is now, strengthening the eastern flank of NATO after the Russian aggression. The European Union did an amazing job in supporting Ukraine. We have the 11 sanctions against Russia. We use the financial instrument called European Peace Facility to support Ukraine. Currently, 5.6 million euros have already spent to support Ukraine with lethal weapons. And the system functions this way. In the EU military staff, we have a coordination cell, a clearinghouse cell, where Ukraine says what demands they have, and then we coordinate among member states and also with third states, with the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, and many other states. We coordinate, the demands and what can we deliver, and what happens then. So, because the European Union cannot procure as an institution ammunition and weapons, so member states deliver on a bilateral basis the lethal weapons to the Ukraine and get the money reimbursed from the European Union in the framework of this financial instrument, European Peace Facility. But what I also want to stress is, many people don't know it, currently we have in the European Union 9 military missions ongoing and 12 civilian missions. And our latest big successful mission is the EU assistant training mission for Ukraine. We have set up last December, and currently 17,500 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained on European soil in Germany and in Poland. And by the end of the year, we want to have trained 30,000 Ukrainian fighters. And I think these are all, I think, success stories. Of course, there are obstacles in the daily work, but I think we have to think positive and we have to move on, as Barbara said. Okay.
Skip, can you think of some potential obstacles that are kind of hampering the, let's say, effective EU-NATO cooperation from the SIPA perspective? Can you think of some?
So I think many have already been mentioned, in terms of kind of institutional inertia, concerns over zero-sum approaches to certain portfolios. If they do it, I can't, or if they have this initiative, that will somehow reduce the value or attractiveness of mine. But political will is at the base. And I'd like to echo what Barbara said for the audience specifically, and that is there's been so much progress, primarily due to necessity and urgency to cooperate. Certainly post-Ukraine 2014, the various EU-NATO cooperation agreements that have been repeatedly signed by Stoltenberg and his counterparts at the Council and Commission. Those are leap forwards, and if you look at the annual reports that are provided by provided for allies and member states, you see regular progress on an annual basis of deepening and broadening the cooperation. And I would say the urgency of cooperation during COVID to provide assistance across the European theater, across the Transatlantic community, to provide supplies to needed health authorities and publics, sharing information, fighting disinformation from Russia and China, all those led to significant amount of cooperation for assistance and information sharing and cooperation in communications. And then, with Ukraine invasion, the same thing has happened. And I think you've seen the maturity of the relationship grow over time, and the significance of the leaders coming together that was identified a couple of times is not just the face value of seeing them speak together on television or in a press statement, but actually bringing along their communities in terms of ministers that sit in both the areas or others don't, that sharing the information that at the very highest level helps the policymakers and the decision makers to ensure the kind of cooperation that's needed. So I think it's moving forward well, and the obstacles that remain, tend to be of very specific national interest. We talked about Cyprus and Turkey, but there are others, and so that's going to probably persist. But I think we're on the right direction.
Thank you, Skip. James, the same question for you. Can you think of some potential obstacles hampering the mutual cooperation?
Yeah, so again, I think the other speakers have covered this really well. So I agree with all that's been said. I think to avoid regurgitating any of their points, if I broaden it slightly to look not just at EU-NATO cooperation, but at kind of European or Euro-Atlantic defense cooperation in all institutional frameworks. I think there are, as has been said, the political will is always the key. I think there are huge kind of institutional, bureaucratic process, culture and money barriers always to change, but all of those can be overcome with will. And we've obviously had an external shock, and an external shock in the form of the invasion of Ukraine. And external shocks historically have always been what galvanized transformational change and overcome some of those kind of national level political hesitations about trading away sovereignty, spending money, taking risk. So I think there is, as has been rightly said, there's huge momentum. We need to make sure we now kind of take that momentum forward, and I think be as ambitious with that as we possibly can. So I think in terms of some of the priority areas for me where I would like to see a kind of further action towards kind of a more integrated Euro-Atlantic and European approach on defense, it's got to be things like going further on, setting out capability development priorities. That's something that is already, there are mature mechanisms within NATO and in the EU, with the Capability Development Plan or CDP, to do that, but there have always been those national barriers around each nation having its own specific priorities, a lack of specialization, huge duplication of effort between nations, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's an opportunity to go further on that and rationalize and make much more efficient use of the money we are spending on defense, get more bang for our buck, quite literally. I think similarly there's an area, therefore, for great opportunities to go further on things like procurement. We have a European Defence Fund now, we have the various programs kind of around that, so EDIDP, we have the EDERPA recently. There's a bunch of activity there, that is fantastic, but if you look at the overall numbers, the amount of European defence spending in total that goes on joint programs is still like 10%. Yeah. It's not huge, so that could certainly go further. I think similarly that translates into how we look at the industrial base. We have recognized how vital it is to have not just resilience and readiness in our armed forces, but also in the industrial base and the skills base, all the people that work in defense industry and the supply chain, to scale that up and put it on a war footing. Yeah. And I think finally, it's looking similarly at how we resolve some of those thorny questions that are evolving in the kind of transatlantic alliance about, what does the future of warfare look like? How are we going to integrate new technologies, AI, new domains like space, cyber, etc. And how are we going to do that in a way that doesn't create a greater divergence between the capabilities of the US, which is investing very heavily in some of these very cutting-edge technologies, and looking at a future vision of multi-domain operations that, frankly, most European countries simply cannot afford. So how we enable the US to kind of maximize its cutting-edge capabilities without diverging from Europe, very interesting kind of question. And then similarly, how we start to think ahead from the current problem, which is obviously Ukraine, Russia, this sort of challenge, how we think ahead to the problem that's coming down the line, which is China and other issues, and how we can kind of move towards a more coherent European approach from that. Again, I think there are some big big challenges, but also I would like to see them as big opportunities, because there is so much momentum, as has been said. I think we need to use this opportunity, as has been said, that, the Ukrainians are giving this opportunity for their own blood, and we need to make the most of it.
Quick follow-up question before I pick up the questions from the audience. How many years, James, will have to pass to have all those issues addressed? What is your estimation? 10 years, 20 years? Because you have addressed several serious, domains.
Yeah. So I mean,
what is your prediction?
Just to take one as an example, so the kind of joint capability development and procurement issue. We've had kind of endless initiatives over the last 10, 20 years around that, pooling and sharing, these sorts of issues. It has been slow progress so far. However, I don't think that means progress has to be slow in future. I think we should not forget that there was a world before the NATO or the EU existed, and they were created and in relatively shorter order emerged as institutions, right? So change is possible if there is political will. I originally was a historian by background, and I'm kind of loath to say that military innovation or innovation within alliances is typically driven by being in a war or losing a war. I would quite like us to do this before we have to be in that situation. Would be nice. So I think there is an opportunity. Some of these problems are going to take decades, don't get me wrong, but so perhaps the best time to have solved them would have been 20 years ago, but the second best time would be today. So, we have to not be pessimistic. We are where we are today. We have momentum now, and I think you can make concrete progress in a lot of areas in even 1 year, and we've seen that since February 2022.
Thank you, James. Now, I would like to pick up some questions from the audience. I see one hand up.
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting, and since this is a panel on NATO and NATO-EU cooperation, I think we have the obligation to quote Macron's brain-dead statement about NATO. And as we saw that the Ukraine war was a wake-up call in that regard, my question would be, in a lot of senses and a lot of parts of European security, we are still sleeping or a bit tired. Do we need a second wake-up or just a morning coffee to really get things going when it comes to joint procurement and a lot of other aspects that you all just mentioned?
Can you briefly elaborate on that? Barbara, can you start, please?
Sure. Good point. I think we need a lot of coffee, but I think we need a lot of coffee because we only have 24 hours and only 7 days per week, out of which 2 are weekend, which are stricken out of our calendar lately. So there's only as much we can do, working non-stop, and the challenges are really complex. And whilst the ongoing war against Ukraine is keeping most of us busy, whether I believe it's the same for my EU colleagues or myself or everyone else, we also have many other challenges happening. We have still terrorism brewing and growing, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a big thing we have to really focus on, and it's becoming more and more urgent. We have continued instability in Northern Africa and sort of the arc, which might lead to more migration. We have seen what that has done to European, I wouldn't say security, but internal cohesion, and it was discussed at the earlier panel, which I thought was a very interesting and exciting debate. We have the rise of China, but we also have all these, what we still call emerging security challenges, although I don't think they're so emerging anymore, because as James said, this was emerging maybe 20 years ago. But we still call it emerging. This also shows you that we need to step up the game, whether it's cyber, whether it's what's happening in a space, how we're going to go abroad, dual technologies that was already mentioned, etc., etc. I can go down the list, and we still have, sadly, still 20-odd years later, we still have Western Balkans, we still have Kosovo, we have seen an announcement yesterday of President Vučić. We are still not out of the woods there, so a lot of things to do.
Very briefly,
Yeah,
Admiral,
yeah.
can you elaborate on that,
That was a
briefly?
very good question. What you said, I can also confirm. We don't have to lose our 360-degree focus. So, of course, Ukraine is the top on the agenda, but we have to look to Africa. We have to look to the Indo-Pacific, what happens in the South China Sea, in the Strait of Taiwan, freedom of navigation, free sea lines of communication for our own prosperity, for our economies and so on. We have to look to the Arctic. And we in the EES work also currently very hard on topics, also in close cooperation with NATO. For instance, the implications of climate change on security and defense. This is a topic which will, keep us busy and also is of great concern for the next decades on emerging and disruptive technologies. On space, we just have published the first ever European Union space strategy on security and defense. And there are topics we work very hard, and I think this wake-up call has very well received, and I think it will now that we don't lose the focus also to other areas in the world.
Skip, would you like to also comment on that briefly?
So, I'll try to add a little bit of value, but I think colleagues before Jürgen and Barbara have covered the big things, and that is there is such a large set of threats and challenges above and beyond Ukraine, and just Ukraine and the Russian defense and deterrence adjustments required are huge. So there's much more on the plate of NATO in terms of security and defense, and there's equally a large amount on EU's plate that leaders and officials are challenged to address them all. And I think that they're focusing hard right now on basically ensuring collective defense is on track, while at the same time considering, okay, what are other challenges outside terrorism, missile concerns, hybrid warfare, cyber, regional instability. That's a lot in threats. In challenges, the challenge from China, as Jürgen just mentioned, climate, strategic shocks, endemics. All those require concepts, require policy coordination on what will nations do and can do now to ensure resilience to critical infrastructure, amongst many, many other topics. So I think the security and defense folks are already overwhelmed with collective efforts. And then they're all, I hope you caught that last part. It looked like I was locked for a second.
Thank you, Skip. James, do you have something particular in mind?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it has been a bit of a wake-up call, but I agree there is still a real disconnect, I think, between some of the political rhetoric around, if you look at, say, the head of the British Army has described this as our kind of 1936, 1937 moment, i.e., this is the time where we need to mobilize. This is our kind of one opportunity to rebuild ahead of some sort of even worse crisis than the crisis we find ourselves in. So that's a very urgent and quite alarmist message, and you see a lot of political rhetoric from people across Europe and the US talking about the significance of the moment we're in and the threats that we face. At the same time, I don't think we can realistically say that we have put our societies on a war footing in the way that perhaps the language would suggest we might need to. If you look at the Ukrainians, the lessons there, it's not just that they've had surprising will to fight and resilient armed forces and have been able to scale those up, of course, with Western help. But it's also been that they've been able to mobilize supply chains, they've been able to mobilize industrial base, they've been able to mobilize all of society. There are individual Ukrainians now, taking photos of a Russian tank and posting it into a kind of command and control system. They're taking huge risk with innovation around technology. They are, breaking things fast because they have to. We are unfortunately in the West, we are certainly gearing up, and that is great. But I think there is a lot more we can do to move from a kind of peacetime footing towards a wartime footing, and to improve our ability to mobilize all of society. And I think for me, the point I want to make here, really, to finish off, is that means we need, I think, a much more honest debate with the public about the types of challenges we face. Because as has been said, there are 25 challenges that we could probably sit here and talk about, which we still describe as emerging, but many of them have emerged. But these are the conversations that happen in these fora between kind of, people who work in these areas, or they're students or civil society. But it isn't something that is necessarily penetrating through to the general public as much as perhaps it should. That's not a problem Ukraine has for obvious reasons. War has become very real for them. But I think we need, to recognize that the traditional distinctions between war and peace don't apply anymore. The distinctions between home and away don't apply in a war anymore. We're engaged in an era of great power competition that affects everybody, affects businesses, it affects individual citizens, and of course it affects governments and militaries. And there's certainly a lot more that needs to be done, I think, from politicians to have that kind of honest debate with people about what that means for them and their lives.
Thank you, James. Is there one more question? And please, sir, if you can dedicate your question to one particular speaker, that we can make more questions potentially.
Okay. The Russian attack against Ukraine, that's also attack against the Western values. On the other side, we in Europe, it's a European war from my perspective, we have a target of 10% for the defense budget. And if you take into consideration that next year we have the election of the new US president and Trump runs for president once more, should Europe prepare for being ready that Trump will be president and we have to accelerate reaching the 2% defense budget target? I think the question should be for the general. I think it's a good idea.
For Skip. Skip, please, can you briefly address this question?
Okay, so I'm not a political analyst to begin with, but I have been a planner for most of my career. So planning for the worst is not a bad policy. That said, I would say that regardless of where U.S. election goes or individual European nations go with leaders, the 2% defense investment should be considered a fluke. Part of the discussion that's been ongoing some time. It may be part of the buildingist debate, but or results of decisions. But the point is that the 2% investment is not a insurance against the U.S. disengagement or involvement or whatever. It's for European defense, and so that should be met by its own, raison d'être, to ensure that the European allies or our allies meet their own, Washington Treaty, NATO treaty obligations to have the capabilities and readiness of forces to be able to defend themselves as well as contribute to the collective defense should another ally be attacked. So I don't think that's a factor in decision-making with respect to the future U.S. president. Now, I think that the Europeans will watch very closely who takes the lead and what happens. And will a Trump 2, administration occur? Will it be the same or very different from the previous? That's all to be said, all to be seen. So I wouldn't speculate on that.
Okay, thank you, Skip, for a moment. We've got time for one more quick question from the audience dedicated to one speaker. I also maybe some of the ladies raising hands. If you can then pass the microphone.
Yeah, so thank you for all the interesting discussions. I'm not sure I share the same positivity about EU-NATO cooperation. There's been you've mentioned a lot of initiatives in both institutions. And, to start off with, there's in NATO, there is the NDPP. In the EU, you have the CDP. Then NATO just created Diana. The EU created HEDI. So it feels like there's a lot of repetition. And even in the ammunitions and joint procurement, the EU established the Joint Procurement Task Force, and it's looking at acquiring ammunitions, but it's restricted to 25 member states that adhere to it, plus Norway. And it's focused on acquiring from the European defense industry. But at NATO, you already had an NSPA, the Ammunition Support Partnership. So why didn't you use that venue instead of creating a new initiative within the EU, especially when you are excluding already one of the biggest ammunition productions
Can you narrow your question,
Yeah, sorry.
please, to our speakers?
No, so I would just like, just bearing in mind that besides having a single set of forces, we have a single set of industry and also a single set of budget. So do you think it makes sense to have this constant duplication of efforts with the EU? Like, why is this happening? How don't you have any bad things to say about EU-NATO cooperation? Like, because from the EU-NATO declaration, I don't see any actions coming from. It's a lot of rhetoric, but actively on these. Yeah.
I would say this is a perfect question for the Admiral here, since you developed on the duplications. Admiral, quick reaction, please.
First of all, you are very well informed, but I don't see it. I don't see it as a duplication. I just want to take the example of joint defense procurement. So we have now initiatives in the European Union. We call it a three-track approach to ramp up the production of ammunition and missiles for Ukraine, but also for own member state stocks, and also to ramp up production lines of industry with money from the European Peace Facility and with money from the EU budget. And this was discussed closely with NATO, that there is not a competition with NATO. So all these measures, all these incentives for the European defense industry to ramp up production and to ramp up their production lines are discussed in very close cooperation with NATO, I can say, and I don't see here any. I don't see here any duplication. For me, it's a complementary effort.
Skip has raised his question, his hand. Please, can you quickly respond? Skip,
I'll just add a couple points. Jürgen made the point that the, can you hear me? Okay. What I was going to say was, having been focused on defense investment for my last 4 years and closely working with European counterparts, not just on defense planning, but on the actual capability development aspects, I would say there's more business than the institutions can currently handle if the allies or member states were actually cooperating at the level that they need to basically enjoy the economy of scale and the opportunities that defense industry writ large can provide in terms of meeting national defense needs. More spending, will lead to greater cooperation, perhaps greater industry rationalization as well. It's already happening naturally, organically. So frankly, I would say that what you've identified in terms of procurement opportunities, in terms of innovation initiatives, are all good. And they're not at a scale right now that they overlap in a dysfunctional way.
Well, thank you, Skip. Well, time has come to its end. I would like to thank all of our distinguished speakers for their brilliant comments. I believe they deserve a huge applause. Thank you. I also encourage all of you here then to catch up with our speakers during the networking session, which is going to be from 5 p.m. on. And before you all go to the coffee break, I would like to just briefly remind you that the final panel, moderated by Moritz, will begin in about 30 minutes. So the public panel, Dreams, Doubts, and Dependencies on the Transatlantic Alliance. So I hope to see you all here. Thank you, and once again, thank you to the speakers. Have a great day.
Thank you.